Good morning to all of you. Muy buenos días a todos. I am Gabriela Lemus, the Executive Director of Maryland Latinos Unidos. For those of you who this is your first time joining us, welcome. And for those of you who've been joining us for the last year and a half, welcome back. We are really excited today to celebrate Pride Month. MLU has invited Dr. Carlos Rodríguez Díaz to engage and educate us not only about Pride Month from a Latino perspective with a special focus, but also on a special focus on Latino youth. Dr. Rodríguez Díaz is currently an associate professor at the Milken Institute School of Public Health at George Washington University. I apologize, doctor. And he is the president of the Society of the Scientific Study of Sexuality. As I was going over his bio, I was just so impressed at the career that he's had thus far as a doctor, as an academic, as an activist. And I think what's really near and dear to my heart, and he actually highlights it, is as a mentor. He's completed postdoctoral training in HIV and global health research. And he has a PhD in public health with a major in community health and a master's in public health in health education. He's also completed postgraduate training in health policy, human rights, and health diplomacy. So in today's conversation, we wanted to focus on Latino youth. And what we know is that overall, post-COVID, all youth have been experiencing mental health challenges, particularly Latino youth and other youth of color. But for Latino LGBTQ youth, these challenges are multiplied. And they're multiplied by very real day-to-day social and cultural challenges that many have been facing as they develop into adulthood. Now, the 2021 Surgeon General report that came out in November of last year on mental health states, mental health affects every aspect of our lives, how we feel about ourselves and the world, how we solve problems, cope with stress, overcome challenges, how we build relationships and connect with others, and how we perform in school and at work and throughout life. Mental health encompasses our emotional, psychological, and social well-being and is an incredibly essential component of overall health. As I said at the beginning, Latino youth already face many bumps in the road, especially as relate to their identity. When I think about, I first came to the United States, I was 14 years old, and I grew up in Puerto Rico, but I was born in Mexico. So I would go back and forth between Puerto Rican and Mexican culture, which in and of itself is different, but there's certain categories that are similar. These challenges that I faced in terms of my identity are multiplied for young Latino LGBTQ youth. So the Human Rights Campaign came out with a report in 2012 called Supporting and Caring for Our Latino Youth. And they share there that concern about family acceptance is the top problem identified by Latino LGBTQ youth, and having their families accept and support them is a key change they wished for in their lives. The same report asserted that LGBTQ Latino youth are more likely to face harassment and violence in the community than their non-LGBTQ Latino peers, and are much less likely to participate in a variety of community activities. So myself, as an example, way back when in the Stone Age, I would isolate myself. I would self-isolate because I felt I didn't quite fit in the United States. I didn't fit in any one category. I think were I to have this other, component to my life, it would have really been, stressful. And finally, more than a third of LGBTQ youth, Latino youth, about 35% said that their community in which they live did not generally accept LGBTQ people in general, but that 48%, almost 50% said that things were getting better and that there is a process of acceptance that is begun. So I think, and what we saw is that certainly the challenges that affect Latino LGBT youth are not exclusive to this community, but it is reasonable to assume that a population that struggles to access services such as education, health, and housing, problems related to sexual orientation and gender identity are also multiplied as compared to their non-Latino peers. So I would now like to hand it over to Dr. Carlos Rodríguez Díaz and start the conversation by asking you about, wow, your journey. I mean, you made some really clear decisions about the direction you wanted to go. You decided to go into public health. I mean, when I look at your bio, it's wow, it's astounding. And you grew up in Puerto Rico. And so talk a little bit about your experience growing up on the island and what you found, like, as most kids do, most challenging, but also what excited you, what got you motivated and sort of directed you into public health.
Gabriela, thank you. Buenos dias. Good morning. It is my pleasure to be here today. I am very fortunate to have the opportunity to join you in this conversation. And fortune, I believe, is what have helped me achieving some of the things that you have highlighted when you introduced me. Growing up in Puerto Rico. So first, let me tell you, I grew up in a farm in Aguas Buenas, Puerto Rico, surrounded by animals as an only child in a mixed-race household. My father was presenting as Afro-Caribbean, and my mom is second-generation Spanish family in Puerto Rico. I never had to think about race until I was probably like 20 when I came to the United States for graduate education, and I had to fit the boxes on race and ethnicity. In Puerto Rico, we don't think of race and ethnicity the same way we have to do in the United States. But I'll continue that story later in terms of race and ethnicity. Regarding sexual orientation and growing up, sometimes feeling different, sometimes feeling like I didn't belong. I was fortunate to have parents that understood me before I could understand myself, and that provided the resources for me to explore life in a safe way, and that had as a core value education. And they encouraged me to grow, to explore, and to embrace everything that I was. I can speak for hours about the experience, but I think a personal experience kind of embrace what my lived experience in Puerto Rico was. I was always very afraid of coming out to my father as a gay man because he was always tough presenting. He had a job that grabbed a lot of attention and that came with a tough personality as well. And I had a really beautiful relationship with him that I didn't want it to, put at risk. But he invited me and what at that time was my boyfriend, but he thought he was my friend, to stay with him. And he was embracing the whole thing, and he was understanding everything. Like I didn't have to say anything. Long story short, I tried to come out to him in the car as we were driving to do groceries. And it was like the very stereotypical conversation of me feeling very ashamed, like I cannot do this. Dad, I have to tell you something. But Dad, I want you to know that, but Dad, and I was not saying anything. And he stopped me and he said, you are my only child. I want you to be happy. Do with your life whatever you want to do, as long as you're staying healthy and happy. And I just stayed quiet and I said, oh, I think he got it. So I know that that's a very beautiful story to tell. But as you asked me about the experience in Puerto Rico, I know that that's not the narrative that so many people like myself have to share about their upbringing. So in part, that's what motivated me to engage in public health and activism. And I found the field of public health to be interdisciplinary enough that could allow me to grow in different areas and bring and build different skills. And at the same time health is political. I grew up with a very strong political education, and I found a passion that was also connected with my personal passion. So as you said, I think I believe in mentorship because I found mentors throughout my careers that helped me just building my own experience and who I am as a scientist nowadays. So in a nutshell, I think that describes how I ended up here. I'll have to say, I grew up in Puerto Rico, and after I finished all my education, I stayed in Puerto Rico, and I was affiliated to the School of Public Health at the University of Puerto Rico. And that was my dream job because I wanted to change things in Puerto Rico. Over the time, I also realized that the political relationship of Puerto Rico with the continental US, a colonial relationship, was interplaying heavily in all the work that I wanted to do. And sometimes you just have to visit the mouth of the lion to really make a change and disrupt the system. And that's how I ended up in DC. Fortunately, George Washington University have welcomed me, and it's providing the resources for me to continue doing work in Puerto Rico, Latin America, and the Caribbean, while also engaging with my new communities that have embraced me so nicely and warmly here in the DMV.
That's an awesome story. Wow. I don't even know what to say. I'm so touched. I can just visualize the conversation with your dad. But going to the point that not everybody has such a positive experience, right? In my opening, I mentioned some of the problems faced by Latino LGBTQ youth in this particular study. What do you think on the matter? What are some of the most important problems and challenges facing this young population group of wonderful folks? Oops, you're on mute.
I am sorry. Yeah, that's a classic correction these days. So something I want to put in everybody's radar right now is how we understand our own experiences and the experiences of the people that we work with. We are not unidimensional. We are not just man, woman, a person of trans experience, or gay, lesbian, Latina. We are all our identities at the same time, and they're interplaying, interacting, and are presenting when we are, and are also perceived by the beholder, and in different ways. So to answer your question, first let's think about the age group, right? Youth are in a developmental stage of their lives that it is very important to provide with resources so they can grow and identify what they need to become the persons that they could be. They need access to education, health, and we as societies need to nurture communities and families that are conducive to that experience, the best experience that our youth could have. Then socially speaking, we have made LGBTQ people socially vulnerable because of our heteronormative way of understanding our own human experience. So LGBTQ youth are at increased risk of all the negative experiences that we have documented among youth, with the highlight that because LGBTQ identities have been stigmatized, often parents, communities are not providing the resources that these kids, youth needs. And to be honest, we don't need to do a lot of things different. What we need to do is to dismantle a heteronormative way of providing services or understanding the needs of our youth. To give you a simple example, in our research with LGBTQ youth, what we have found constantly is that they don't see themselves in health education or sexuality education at school, because all the examples and all the models that are provided are very heteronormative. So we are leaving a gap in their sexuality education that often parents cannot provide because parents were not educated either. And then the negative value that society put on sexual minority and gender minority identities, then just deepen the gap. So that's why we need to pay close attention and be very thoughtful of the inclusivity that we have to provide when creating services and programs for youth in general.
That makes a lot of sense to me, actually. I was I was visualizing my young niece's first sex ed class, and it was exactly as you said. It was very heteronormative,
Yeah.
and she was just like all freaked out. And I'm thinking to myself, but what if this had been a gay child, an LGBTQ child? But you
And if
raised.
you,
Go ahead.
yeah, sorry, and if you don't mind me adding, I think that also we are constantly thinking that sexual orientation is something that you develop later in life.
Mm.
And that's so wrong. We have a sexual orientation from the get-go.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is that we prioritize and basically have created societies that are very heteronormative.
Mm-hmm.
And we think from the beginning that everybody's heterosexual until they prove otherwise,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it is not a topic that we need to leave for later in life, because in fact, we are actually making a damage. We're hurting kids by not making things visible at early age. So I just wanted to add that, because often we don't even think about the sexual orientation of kids, although we actually do, because we ask boys, how many girlfriends do you have, right? Like, not only imposing heteronormative ideas, but also the notion that a boy has multiple partners. And that is part of how we, and then put some of the cultural norms or experiences in the narrative of sexual orientation and identity.
You're making this wasn't part of the questions that I asked, but that I put in our what I was going to ask you, but I'd like to ask it anyway. Please indulge me. I keep thinking about the decisions that have been made in Florida recently for school kids. And I was just wondering if you had some thoughts about how we might counter that, because sadly there's multiple legislation. I mean, what is the impact this is going to have on kids from your perspective, given what you just said?
Well, so first, at home and at their communities, they need love and feeling welcome, right? Because they are hearing all this negative narrative, and they need a balm near them. That's the first thing. And I know that that's a very emotional side of things, but it is personal, it is emotional, right? And then I think we need to work on the counter effect of these policies and discourses with education, with activism, and with science. We need to translate science that has been around for decades now to inform policies. The problem is that we are dealing with policymakers that are not using knowledge, scientific knowledge or evidence to come up with policies. But we need to provide the information and let them in evidence that they are not using the evidence to make decisions. That's one thing. And then we need to educate communities and different groups so that we can multiply the knowledge, because otherwise we let this narrative become the norm, and we cannot allow that.
Right.
So it's intersectional work that we need to do to counterbalance what is going on. And then I think the federal level needs to take some actions as well, because we're going to become a very divided country where we create pockets where it's basically impossible to live if you don't have certain very traditional and normative values.
So to go back to the original set of questions, you also mentioned this in your previous statement that, there is no one culture, that we come with all our layers, right? And there's no single Latino culture, right? We've got at least 20 some odd countries, 26 countries represented, and each one with its own character and characteristics. But there are some shared elements, right? Which is for example, having large families. You're an only child and I'm an only child. So I think right now we've just completely broken the, the data. There's also the centrality of religion and machismo, let's say. So how do you think those elements of Latino culture interact with the rejection or acceptance of LGBTQ people within their families and their communities?
Well, so I want to start by saying something that I think sometimes is received as controversial, but it's true. Sometimes culture needs to change,
yeah.
Right? Cultural values are not often leading to the best outcomes, either socially or health-wise, as is the topic for today. So we need to change some cultural elements that we have kind of taken as given, that really are just values or experiences, practices that we decide to integrate into the experience of for our general well-being. I will use as an example to go very extreme, female genital mutilation in several countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and other countries is considered like a cultural value. Well, it's also a human right violation, right? So we need to change culture. I am not saying here that we have to eliminate religion, that we have to eliminate familismo and other values, but we need to kind of critically think about what they mean, right? I will use again my own personal experience. That is also kind of an experience that we have documented through research. My mom is a very religious person. She's Catholic. She attends church every day, and she volunteered at church, and she'd go there, I don't know, every other day. But at the same time, early when I came out, that was a problem. And it was part of the discussions that we have in terms of acceptance and understanding. Nowadays, and what led her to this point was, I have one child, and I'm not going to risk my relationship with my child based on some ideas of my faith. So where do I find a place where I can continue having faith and practice in a community of faith that I feel part of, but I don't put at risk the relationships in my family? I am not her, so I cannot tell you all the details about how she manages, but she manages beautifully. And she talks at church about me and my husband. And recently I was in Puerto Rico, and I went to church to help her putting things around, because I understand the value of a community of faith. And faith could come with very many strengths. So I think that's where we should focus, right? So when we do research, for example, we have communities of faith that are welcoming of sexually diverse, gender diverse populations. So let's work with those organizations, right? For some people, faith is important. So when we are intervening, we can consider how faith could be part of what we do to help them stay healthy. And for those who have had negative experience with faith, and unfortunately there are many of those, then we have to work on a healing process and help them navigating how you can heal relationships that perhaps have been hurt by religious ideologies.
I agree with that. I don't know why, but the whole divorce thing came in my head, about how, challenging divorce has been through centuries, actually, and how religion has, been slower to adapt and I don't want to say acculturate, but yeah, it's, kind of move with the times, I think, is where we're going with this. So the Center for American Progress, which is a big think tank in DC, did studies, and they have some 2020 data that showed that Hispanic LGBTQ individuals report experiencing discrimination at a rate 15% points higher than their white LGBTQ counterparts. These disparities were more evident in access to critical services, which is part of our health equity challenge, benefits usage, access to mental health care, and educational settings. Do you think this has started to change over the last few years? and what work is being done to overcome these types of circumstances? Do you even agree with that statement? Let's start there.
Well, so we, over time, we have been able to document better the challenges in access to care based on the different identities of the people that we are studying, right? I think historically we were very limited to just racial differences. And for so many years, big studies and census data and government surveys were not even asking about sexual orientation. So it was very
That's true.
limited, the information that we had. That changed a little bit a few years ago under the Obama administration. Then the past administration, well, you know what happened there. And now we're trying to come up with new solutions on data collection that can help us identify the challenges and again, looking at the data from an intersectional perspective, because it's the combination of being Latino and LGBTQ, and if to that you add experiences of migration, perhaps language, we need to get to those nuances to then understand where are the real inequities and how we can address them, right? So I think that that's the kind of work that we are doing right now. That's the kind of work that I'm trying to do here in the DMV area, having the privilege of being bilingual and conducting research with Spanish-speaking Latinos and English-speaking Latinos in different geographical areas. Is helping me to understand the nuances of just a very specific regional area, but then mixing it up with migration, time in the DMV area, specific sexual orientation or gender identity, language, and now it's helping me to come up with better recommendations, I think, right? Like for Spanish-speaking Latino gay men, this is what we need. And for English-speaking Latina transgender women, this is what we need. And so I think research is helping. There's still a lot of work to do. I mean, the last census didn't include questions about sexual orientation or gender identity. So that was a missed opportunity. And we will have to wait until the community surveys start collecting the data to have a better projection for population level actions.
You know, this kind of leads into my next question related to COVID-19. Because there was like this moment between the previous administration and COVID, and this is where you start seeing shifts in data, I think, or at least I noticed. That's when I began to see the differences, even for the collection of Latino data, ethnic data. So do you think that that crisis, maybe one of the positive aspects is this highlighting of the data? Has it shed any light on possibilities that could lie ahead from your perspective? Because you've also been very involved from an epidemiological perspective.
Yeah, muted again. So I think it was timing. It was a change in administration, and unfortunately, the beginning of the pandemic, right? Because early in the pandemic, we couldn't even tell what was the impact in Latino communities in several states in the United States, because we were not collecting data. It was not a mandate to collect data on race and ethnicity. So we had this current administration started during the pandemic. So many decisions were being made for the policy work that we need to do and what we promise we will do, plus we need to respond to a pandemic. So I will give credit to both, right? Because the pandemic also highlighted and give us more evidence of health inequities affecting our communities. So I don't know if this responds to your question, but I think that we need to see the whole picture of how—
the bigger picture.
Yeah, of how our current experiences are influencing how we are collecting data and how we will be able to provide information to inform solutions in the near future.
So one of the things you said in your previous statement was about this, this amazing opportunity you have to look at the migratory process as well. This is more my personal curiosity. Do you see big differences between like those coming from the Caribbean versus those coming from Central or South America? And what do those look like?
Yeah, so there is a main difference between Latino groups in the United States that is defined by the experience of migration, right? From a significant group of people that migrates to the continental US from the Caribbean are from Puerto Rico. And Puerto Ricans have the privilege of having citizenship. So for them, navigating the system, at least avoid that process of being othered as an immigrant. In fact, most people, when they talk about immigration, they don't even think about Puerto Rico because it's like, oh, but you're American already. But it's like, let me tell you, it's not that easy, right? No, on the other hand, the experience of Caribbean Latinos moving to the other Caribbean Latinos moving to the United States are from Cuba and Dominican Republic. We don't have a strong or a big migration coming up, happening right now from the Dominican Republic, but they have enclaves in different states that have resources to their own community. And Cuba is a special case due to the political tensions. So many people that migrate to the United States are under certain permits, or they have certain political and social constraints or resources. Then different areas have different resources for different migrants. So, and we can go for hours about that, but it's not the same to migrate for Central America and stay in the Big Plains than to come to the East Coast, right? And also the experience of migration, depending where the migration started, how long it was, it is associated to health outcomes, because we know that some people, are engaging really risky practices, basically to survive and get to the United States, versus more, let's call it legal way of migrating that might have a different experience and comes with other resources and families living in the continental US. So yes, it's very diverse, and I think it requires to look at the very specifics of the experiences that people who migrate have.
Does that pose challenges for you as you develop your questionnaires? I mean,
yeah.
Yesterday we had a conversation on implicit bias, for example. Like, does that play into it as well?
Yes, but it's a challenge that we have to embrace, because otherwise we are just repeating the systems that continue to erase our identities. Yes, if I try to have a survey in Spanish for different group of Spanish speakers in the DMV area, I just go to the community and I test the survey several times until I have a version that is understood by most. And as many of you here, I think, are bilingual, so you understand, it's not that we speak different Spanish, it's that we use language in a different way sometimes. And we have words that are very specific to countries or cultures. But there is also a way of communicating that help us understand each other. It's like English in the continental US. So that's what I go for. And what I tell my students and what I try to mentor my mentees on is be patient, and it's community center. So until the community is not giving you good feedback about this instrument, it means that you're not ready to collect data. Oh, it takes longer? Yes, but leads you to better data.
A really excellent point, and one I'm going to take to heart because I tend to be very impatient. So, I guess this is a natural segue to my next question around public policy and public health and the crossroads, right? What do you see as that intersection, and how we can learn from this incredible approach, I think, that's community centered to data gathering, and what kinds of opportunities do you think lie ahead? But also, the contrast to that, the ongoing challenges that we're facing that are a little bit harder to move. Any thoughts on that? Mute.
Yeah, I was taking some notes here as we were talking. First of all, as I mentioned, public health is political. And that also means that public health professionals, public health scientists should clearly understand that our work is political and political decisions affect what we can do or can't. But we also need to support stakeholders, policymakers to use public health knowledge to inform policies. And that is a challenge that is more on the public health front than on the public policy area. Policymakers are accustomed to get feedback, even they like it or not, right? Because that's what lobbyists and activists are accustomed to do. But public health scientists and scholars are not even trained to engage in policy. You know, it's not a requirement. And I think we need to improve that. We need to be more engaged in policy, and we need to be better communicators. Because we can have the scientific knowledge, but if we only care about publishing in a scientific journal, we are deserving our communities. So we need to also make that knowledge available to the communities so the communities can advocate and work towards their best interest. Community center public health work should also provide for that, because when work is community center, it should also lead to build capacity in the communities. So it's not only for public health to professionals or scientists to get to the community, do their work and be gone, right? Okay, we achieved the outcome, we're gone. But what you left there is not only, hopefully, it's not only improving the health outcomes, but also you left capacity in the community so the changes made could be sustainable and that they could take it to another level. So I think that's where we are at, and that's my aspiration as a public health scientist. So we get more political and more engaged with the community work that we can do, and definitely become better communicators.
That rings very true to me. Part of the work we've been doing through our MALVIC program, for those of you who don't know, that's the Mid-Atlantic Latinx Vaccine Equity Coalition, blah. The name hopefully will shorten soon. MALVIC has been with our community health workers and getting them trained in organizing, and the technology side of organizing is if they were part of the movement. And it's really been helpful. They've been able to do peer-to-peer networking and advocate on their own behalf, what they had never done before. And I think it opened up avenues for them to look at their work in a different way and look at their roles as, valued, trusted community messengers, more in a more empowered way. I don't feel we empowered anybody. I think they empower themselves. But when you provide those tools and you start shifting that culture and that attitude, it really makes a big difference. So I wanted to get to some of the questions in the chat. We have one here that I think is really critical, which is, do you have some best practices to normalize the sexual identity discussion within families, especially, at home and with families? Do you have some thoughts about how we could help folks do better?
Yeah, I think it starts with example and our engagement in the community, right? So I'll give a quick example. Using pronouns, right? Many people, and I've experienced this in Latino communities and in Puerto Rico in both languages. It's like, why do you have to clarify what are your pronouns? Isn't it obvious? And that's a starting point for a good conversation about why it's important and about visibility and respecting the other person. So I think that we have to provide opportunities so people feel uncomfortable in a very respectful and non-threatening way. Right? I think one of the challenges that we have when we try to change social norms is that we go straight to people and say, that's wrong, you cannot do it. It doesn't work, right? Because people don't want to be challenged like that about norms and values that they have carried for years. So it's more about engaging in the conversation. It's like, why is important? How do you think it means to the other person when you recognize their identity.
Mm-hmm.
And talking about the fact that it's difficult for everybody, right? When we start to change norms, the use of language, it is difficult because we are accustomed to do certain things. But when we are honest in those conversations, I think we get to a place of understanding that could be definitely a better place for changes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the other advice I will give is that we need to be patient. You know, big significant changes don't happen from one day to the other. But we need to, you know, stay tuned and be consistent,
Mm-hmm.
because in the meantime, people are dying. So
Right.
it's not like, you know, it could take forever.
Mm-hmm. And we've we've been talking about the bilingual aspect of all of this, and and the use of the pronouns. And in some ways, I'm more comfortable doing this in Spanish, saying ellas, than I am they, them in English. Even though I feel that, right? So that habituation piece is hard. It's a hard thing to break. And it goes back to that identity piece and how the individual feels. And that basically when you acknowledge that pronoun, you're honoring that individual's identity and how they see themselves. And it's uplifting, right?
Mm-hmm.
So here, hang on. There's another question in the chat. Okay. What are the most common spaces that Latino, hang on a second, Latino LGBTQ youth tend to turn to for support?
Can you repeat it? I cannot see that question.
What are some of the most common places that Latino LGBTQ youth tend to turn to for support?
Great question. So we just finished a study with nearly 2,000 queer youth from all over the continental US and Puerto Rico and Hawaii. And when we look at data across the board, but also among Latinos, where they're looking for information online.
Oh dear.
No surprise, right? The problem is that what is out there is not necessarily reliable or accurate, and can easily take them to sites that are not meant for underage populations, right? So I think some of the findings, so I'm turning those findings into recommendations for actions. And one of the actions that I'm recommending is on working on technology literacy, right? The technology is there. The likelihood that we can stop them from going online is very low. Even if they don't have a cell phone, there's internet at the cafe or at school with friends. Libraries. So the access is there. So it's more about telling them how to assess the information and teaching them technology literacy. There are also some structural things that we can do. So for example, the regulation of certain sites in certain places for depending on age groups. And finally, we need to be out there, right? So if you have an intervention or something for youth and it's not online somehow, we are not on top of the game, right? So recently I just started learning about TikTok. I don't know much about TikTok, but if I want to work with youth and I want to reach out that group, I need to understand TikTok. I am not becoming a user, I think, but I have ads now for some of our studies on TikTok, and we use Instagram and Twitter and spaces that I don't even necessarily know, but that are specific for
Instagram.
Youth.
Apparently,
yeah,
kids,
sure.
69% of kids are on Instagram.
And Snapchat too.
And Snapchat.
Yeah. So that would be part of my advice.
Do you know of any sites that, like, you thought this is being done well?
Oh yeah. So I would put a website here for SICAs. They are doing fantastic work. And they could also, on their website, they have multiple resources on sexuality education. everyone here. And that would be my recommendation to start looking for sexuality education resources for all age groups.
Oh, that's great. It's always good to have a trusted source. So we have a comment in the chat that I find quite positive. In my relationships with trans people, honoring their pronouns and not asking invasive questions has been very important. Sometimes things that I, as a cisgender person, wonder about are, sorry, it's a long one. As a cisgendered person, wonder about are really none of my business. If you can Google it, don't ask. Only ask what are your pronouns and honor that. That's very valuable.
I would, if I may add, that's true. I mean, people of a different experience than ours are not there to teach us. That's not their role, right?
Right.
However, I think that as we tailor interventions or services, we need to ask questions. So for example, in healthcare encounters, I will ask multiple questions because I want to understand this person experience and understanding of the world and their body, everything. So it could vary. I think it depends on the interaction that we're having with people.
And the context, right?
Correct.
So that's an appropriate setting because it's a healthcare setting and it's
correct.
What we're, that's why the person is there, right? They have a healthcare challenge that they're trying to address. And obviously, okay, so this is going to sound weird, but this came up in a different healthcare setting. How does that apply, like when there's a person who's not fully bilingual, who needs a translator and a third person? Does that interrupt that discussion?
No, the translator needs to be literate in the topic. And unfortunately, that I don't think is part of their training. So it's through experience that they learn. But that's a great point, particularly as we are engaging on more work on language justice. How?
Oh, tell me about language justice. This is new.
Oh, well, the fact that we can have a language that is the official language for business, or even in the United States, the official language is English. But that doesn't mean that we need to provide all the services in that language, because by not diversifying the languages that are used in the services that we provide, we are creating gaps for certain groups. We have, I don't know the exact number, but we have multiple languages that are constantly used in the United States. And a good example was the pandemic also at the beginning. Oh, monkeypox is now another one. Public health is doing terribly by creating materials in multiple languages. The CDC took almost, I think it was like 4 months to have reliable information, updated information about COVID in other languages other than English. So that created, that fuel the disparities that we were seeing in the pandemic. And currently, all the monkeypox information that is at the CDC website, that is kind of the resource for public health information, all the information is in English. So personally, the work that I'm trying to do with language justice is when we find these gaps, we immediately try to create reliable and culturally appropriate information in Spanish. So for monkeypox, we created a little website. It's mostly for Puerto Rico, for the projects that we have in Puerto Rico, but it's in Spanish and it's available for everybody on monkeypox, because we don't want to fuel the kind of misunderstanding of the disease, and we want people just to be educated so they can make decisions to stay healthy.
Are there any other sources besides the CDC, maybe the WHO? I mean, I know they kind of got a bad rap at the beginning of the pandemic, but they seem to have caught up a bit.
Yeah, so WHO and PAHO, for example, sometimes have information in Spanish. One of the challenges is that sometimes it's not appropriate for Spanish speaker in the continental US, because the references are for Spanish speakers outside of the United States, right? Because they are producing work for Latinos in Latin America.
Mm-hmm.
So the information is reliable, but if we want the information does not have references to, let's say, services in your area,
Mm-hmm.
or when vaccines were available, the information about vaccines from WHO and PAHO was delayed compared to the continental US, because vaccines were available here before other countries in Latin America, and the vaccines that were available here were different than some of the vaccines that were available in the country, so that the information was not really useful.
So this is kind of a natural segue to my next question, which is, we're a nonprofit sector. Most of us are C3s. How can the sector then advance our, all of these language justice, equity, LGBTQ justice, for youth especially? Like, how can we be supportive? What can we do? How can we do better?
Yeah, so there's a comment that just came out in the chat that I totally agree, Esther. We have to be co-creators of materials. We need to stop the process of just creating in English first and then we translate into Spanish, because we lose a lot and we are not necessarily addressing the needs of our communities. And that also applies for all languages. And I think a feasible starting point for non-for-profit organizations is to provide training, capacity building to the staff on all these topics, engage the professionals that are making decisions, providing services, so they are aware of, depending on the topic of the different areas, but also the organization itself have to look at their own policies, right? Mm-hmm. If you believe in some systemic changes, your organization must reflect those values as well. So that is the way of ensuring environments where these changes are possible. And when an organization reflects certain values, the consumers, the population that we serve, also see those values.
Heather just wrote, Heather's our CEO for Maryland Nonprofits, and she says, I had an aha moment, co-creating instead of translating for our work moving forward, in adapting and simplifying the standards for excellence resources in English and Spanish. Thank you. I love that. We'll help you co-create, Heather. So that is something I'm very proud of, the fact that our Malvec website was created in Spanish first to be translated into English. And I know that sounds crazy, but our goal really was to reach our community in a very direct way, where they felt comfortable. And like, I don't know, my brain works differently in one language versus the other, and how I even approach topics culturally changes. For me, English is my academic language, for example. It is my science language. Even when I studied in Puerto Rico, they taught us that. In science, we're taught in English, science and maths. I really hope, let's see, we're down to 2 minutes. We'd like to see official bilingualism in the US. Yes, that would be amazing. I think, the snippet of George Washington never intended for the United States to be English monolingual, just so you know that, because so many folks helped out with the wars of independence from many different countries, and he was respectful of that. So I just want to put that on the table. At least that's how I was taught. So do you have any more advice for us, for our Latino families, and how we approach our LGBTQ youth, and what we can do moving forward all together collectively as a community? Big question. Yeah. No pressure.
Well, 30 seconds, right? No, I would say embrace all our identities. We are very diverse in many different ways. We have learned on how to respect certain values and norms. We're just adding to that list of values and experiences that we need to respect. We don't have to agree all the time. We don't have to be like each other. In the diversity of our community is what makes it fabulous. So embrace that fabulousness. And we we do many things with love, right? And I think that love is a feeling that we often mention. As a scientist, sometimes it's difficult to talk about feelings, right? That you cannot necessarily assess, but because it's so attached to some of our norms and cultures, embrace it too, you know. And at the family level, we love each other, we protect each other, we care about each other. So just bring those values and practices to our Latino family.
I love it. No, you know, it's what it is. And with that, you hit 10 a.m. You're amazing.
No, thanks for the opportunity. I'm going to write my email here in the chat. So if anybody wants to follow up, want some more information, some papers that I have mentioned, whatever, my email is open.
Thank you, Carlos. Dr. Rodríguez Díaz. Carlos, the two, I mean, they're intertwined. They're part of your identity, both titles. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. It's really been a great presentation. I learned a lot, and I hope you'll continue to join us as we move forward, Team MLU. Thank you so much, and have a great day and rest of your week, everybody.
Gracias, que tengan buen día.
We'll see you next month. Que tengan buen día, that you have a beautiful day.